are now on the second installment of our little three-part series on esoteric, occult, and spiritual Los Angeles. And last time, as some of you will remember, I went into sort of little personal account as to how I came up with the curious idea that Los Angeles is the new Alexandria, and how that in turn was supported and verified by a random comment once when I was there by Mr. Manly Hall, and that of course filled me with so much pride and hubris that I almost floated away like a blimp. Hopefully I didn't look like one. But in any event, Alexandria, of course, being sort of really the archetype of the city where, in a certain historical period, for extending more or less about 500 years or so, the great representatives of the esoteric tradition, particularly the three-leaved clover, as I like to call it, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and Neoplatonism flourished, and from whence, actually, we might say, at least historically, all of the various schools and movements and individuals of the esoteric tradition ever after derived their material and their inspiration. Now, that being the case, perhaps at first this evening we may turn our attention to the larger context within which, of course, our dear Los Angeles exists, namely America, the United States itself, and I already said a few words about that last time. I came across an interesting quotation attributed to the founder-president of the Theosophical Society, Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, whose picture with the great big beard reposes over there among the others right next to the charter on the wall. But that's how he looked in old age, when he cherished his beard, I think, very, very highly. And I know that most of you would not call yourselves theosophists, and it may not be this particular person, and that movement might not be of great import to you. But let's say, even though I belong to the Theosophical Society now over 60 years, and I traveled lecturing for the society on 3 continents, and what else can I brag about? In any event, it's been a very important outlet for my dedication and activities, but quite aside from any personal regard that I or others may have, there is absolutely no doubt about it that beginning with the middle of the 19th century, this was the most important repository and form of the esoteric tradition, and that in many ways the innumerable branches of the tradition, the many various schools and philosophies and activities which, among others, I found when coming here to Los Angeles, practically without exception had in some ways either been brought into existence or otherwise greatly influenced by this curious group of people who got together in November 17th, should be pretty soon, 1875 in New York City, and founded the Theosophical Society. Now, this gentleman with the great beard, whom I will quote right now, who was from a very good Connecticut Yankee family, I mentioned it before, who teamed up with the Russian-born but by then naturalized American citizen, Madame Blavatsky, and they are regarded as the two founders and the two leaders. Now, I read many of the diaries of Colonel Olcott and a wonderful biography which was published a few years ago and which in its original edition, let's see, was called Hammer on the Mountain. Nice poetic, and then the second edition they changed the title. That's how people are. But in any event, I know quite a bit about the man, and he was a very unusual and very perceptive individual in more ways than one. Now, while browsing through some of my books this week, I came across a little account of an incident wherein in 1891, very close, probably only a few months away from Madame Blavatsky's death. Madame Blavatsky was in London at that time. Colonel Olcott, her friend and associate, was traveling in Australia. And he wanted apparently to express his sort of specific regard in the Australian milieu and in the soul of the Australian people. So he said the following: the Australian temperament is evolving. Well, that's evolving in 1891. And then this is the important part for our purposes, like the North American, mystical tendencies and capabilities, it is evolving mystical tendencies and capabilities. Now, so here he attributes such tendencies to the USA first, and then he says that the Australians are moving somewhat in that direction. And this, I think, is of importance, because what we have in our little study of the New Alexandria, Los Angeles, of course, the greater context is that of the United States, and beyond that, perhaps of the American continent itself. And so we are dealing here with a demographic from the very beginning, really, of the American Republic, and therefore we might assume in various ways beyond that, of, as he calls it, mystical tendencies and capabilities. Now, there is always a relationship between what might be called the psyche, the soul of a land, of a continent, of a country on the one hand, and the culture that develops there, even when the people, or eventually who mostly come to inhabit it, come from elsewhere. So there is an important relationship. And what we find in the background, let us say, of North America is that it is in many ways very different different from the background of the demographics of much of Central and South America. And I am not about to exalt and praise many of the qualities of the Central and South American original inhabitants, because in many ways the history there is very dark. There are bloodthirsty gods, which the Gnostic calls archons, which are somewhat like malign archetypes that may still influence us in later times. And a conclusion may be drawn from the history of Mesoamerica that one should not sacrifice life for gods or spirits. The coming of certain Western ideas, both Christian and of the era of the Enlightenment, brought particularly to the largely much less inhabited North American continent certain ideas, and these brought an increasing concept of the value of individual life and the dignity of the individual, which I think acted as a good background for the subsequent movement of the esoteric tradition to this continent and beyond. Because the Indian or Native American background of the present-day United States, or what became the United States, is very specific. It is warrior-like, psychologically speaking, but not collectivistic. The spiritual ideal, for instance, of the Plains Indians, as they were referred to, and many other tribes here, was that, say, of the hunter-shaman, and that indicates individuals who, while they may be loosely connected in tribes, rely on themselves, rely on their own resources, both physically and spiritually, provide their own resources. And so I think that we might say that in the psychic atmosphere of the North American continent, there were already some of the seeds of what became the soul of America and the soul of the United States. Individuals who provide for themselves and for their dependents, and who are used to making their own decisions. And this, of course, carried over with the coming of the European settlers subsequently, so that it remained the keynote of what I would like to call the soul of America. And this is, I think, quite important. So the successor of the hunter-shaman on the land that became the USA, the successor has become a people with a mystically founded optimism. And this mystically founded optimism was there in the early United States, and which became an aspect of Occult America, and which certainly had its impact upon our city of the angels also. And as we already touched on some of these before, I will just summarize that the let's say the branches of the material direction of the early American spirituality, healing, striving for such success, were all based to a very large extent on dealing with and on releasing the individual capacities of people. When you studied some of the history, and I referred to that before, of this really very large number of highly unusual spiritual groups who settled initially in the Hudson Valley of New York State, you find that there is a tremendous amount of emphasis on individual insight, on the individual striving for spiritual things, an individualistic religion and spirituality. And so all of the movements, as we mentioned before, started in the east of the United States and then moved from there first to the Midwest and eventually to the West, where we find ourselves also. What I'm trying to convey, probably inadequately, is that there seems to have existed a predisposing atmosphere in North America that subsequently became the nourishing ground of the esoteric tradition in North America, and perhaps to a lesser and modified degree to the entire American culture and civilization itself. And I refer you in terms of literature there to this is an earlier work by our friend Mitch called Occult America. It's one of the most wonderfully put together works. And then following upon that and really bringing some of the conclusions of the foundational element more into a contemporary scene, also on other this is Mitch Horowitz, by the way, on other work called One Simple Idea, and I'll speak of both of them. So what is let's say the spiritual ancestry? What is the psychic atmosphere in early America, out of which grew both the outer and the inner development of this most unusual country? A biblical saying that the child is father to the man. It's a wise metaphor. In many ways, the past is not really the past, is not really past, but it is with us. even as individuals we carry our past in this lifetime with us, so does a continent, so does a nation, and so do certain spiritual developments and traditions within that context. The implications and the ramifications of this circumstance are many, although here we shall only explore a little of that. The set of implications that I want to look at here for a few minutes may be called by the much abused term spiritual, or by the often misunderstood term called psychological. The spiritual traditions and practices have two parts or aspects, somewhat like the human psyche in general, an outer or conscious one and an inner or unconscious one. I recommend a little volume entitled C.G. Jung Speaking. I can give you the publication data if anybody likes it. And there we find Jung's statements that he referred to what is our main concern here, namely in the unconscious of the USA, the present USA, in the dark recesses of the collective mind, as it were, is a rich heritage of ancient origin, mainly to be traced to the original or aboriginal psychology of this land. Jung even used the term that still very influential, although outwardly practically disappeared. There is the Indian soul in America. Needless to say, he wrote that when that term was not frowned upon and replaced by Native American, which incidentally a lot of the Native Americans don't like. I have a contact in Montana who was a very prominent tribal leader and even represented a lot of the tribes in Washington and all of that. I can't think of his last name, but he always signed his letters to me Kenny. Very, very prominent man over there. And Kenny said that the term that he and his people detest the term Native American. He says that's a whitey's name. He says, and he had a whole curious theory, which may or may not be true. I mean, he's a smart man, as to how the term Indian really came into existence. He said it wasn't that Columbus thought that he was in India, and therefore he called the people there Indian, but that when the Padres came and converted and dealt with the tribes, they referred to the natives as our children in God, nuestros niños in Dios, and that this became los indios, the Indians, but that it had to do with the term the children of God, which I think is a much nicer origin than any other, one could say sort of semi-metaphysically that there is and this is what Jung expressed, that there is a substratum of Indian, Native American presence in the very soil of the USA, which has been influential through much of the history of the USA. And that even though it may not be out there outwardly, it may not appear in a lot of publicity, it sort of radiates out of the soil of the United States. Jung had some, incidentally, Jung had some interesting contact with that milieu, because he befriended a particular tribal leader. Some kind of Lake was his name, and he went with that tribal leader to the ancient cave dwellings of the Anasazi Indians, and so on. Studied a good deal of it, and they corresponded. He often quoted this tribal leader on some very funny things. For instance, the Indian leader said to Jung, "You know, doctor, the white man is crazy." And Jung said, "Well, I'm a psychiatrist, so I know a little bit about that." And then he said, because the white man thinks, that's the mythos, that he thinks with his head. He says, we think with our heart. People who think with their head are crazy. And Jung said, well, there is something to be said for that point of view. He learned quite a bit about much of that mentality from there. So I would say, therefore, that there is, it needs to be considered that there is a real ancient spiritual, psychological background, something that is in the land, something that is in the soil, and that was here long before the settlers came from across the ocean, and that to this day makes its contribution in a mysterious and sort of underground way to the culture. And you can see that the large volume which Mr. Mitch Horowitz collected within the last couple of years and then published, which has all of the essays, recorded lectures, and various other works of Manly Palmer Hall that relate to America. Very fine book. And you can see there that the early chapters, as they are now arranged, all have to do with ancient America. And so Mr. Hall felt, and undoubtedly he had good reasons for believing that there is an ongoing significant contribution of what might be called ancient America to especially the spiritual and, as we might say, in a sense, psychological ambience of this country. Mr. Mitch Horowitz, by the way, who I think is probably the best esoteric historian whom we have publishing books at the present time, he wrote in his inscription to me of his collection of Manly Hall's writings about America. This is what Mitch wrote to me: "Nothing is stranger than truth." Quite true. And indeed, excuse me, nothing is stranger than truth. In other words, here is this, these things are true, but they're so strange. And I think I have to agree with him. Not the strangest is perhaps the way the what we could call perhaps the Amerindian spirit has influenced the psychology over a long period of time of the American people. And I don't think that we would be able to relate to the now existing various branches and modifications of teaching and so forth of the esoteric tradition as they exist in our fair city, if we did not take this fairly seriously into consideration. There have been references in some, fairly well-informed past literature to the Amerindian influence on the USA itself. The Iroquois Federation, for instance, called the Great League of the Iroquois by Manly Palmer Hall, and all sorts of influences which, according to some fairly serious historians, particularly the Iroquois Federation, acted as a sort of an early archetypal model for the government of the United States of America once the independence was declared. So it has been recognized since the late 19th century researches conducted by anthropologists, originally mostly Russian anthropologists in Siberia, that there existed a spiritual, a religious phenomenon in archaic humanity, which they still could discover particularly in Siberia, because, Siberia is one of those places everybody knows where it is, but unless you have to, you don't go there. And so the psychology of the people living there for a long period of time has not been influenced very much by outside forces. So that, let's say, it was discovered by pretty serious scholars that there existed a spiritual religious phenomenon in archaic humanity. I don't like to use the term primitive if I don't have to, because it's a little bit of a put-down word, oh, you primitive, although maybe sometimes it's not, but in any event, which they especially found at that time in Siberia, that was still there, and around, and some, and also among some Native Americans, that came to be called shamanism. And the 20th century saw much scholarly research on the subject, pioneered by the exiled Romanian scholar, my almost countryman, because, Transylvania is part Hungarian, part Romanian, and part vampire. At least so people look at it here. I have been in small parts of not of Siberia, thank God, but of Transylvania, and it's a remarkable country. It's one of the, in fact, I think it's the only place. It's the only place in not only in Eastern Europe, but in Europe, where you find pretty large stretches, although they are in the mountains, of primeval forests, forests that have never been touched by human hands. And of course, very large numbers of bears, which maybe you have to be careful with if you get very close to them, because they are very, very strong and very, very wild. I had once again, it's the custom of old people to reminisce, So it's a little reminiscence. I had a lady who was a very good friend of our families and who started working for us as a tutoress to me when I was in elementary school, and who then got an appointment by the Hungarian government in the part of Transylvania which was given back to Hungary during the war. Anyway, she became a school teacher out in the Transylvanian mountains. And while to my great regret she did not encounter any vampires that she talked about, but she did encounter bears, and some of her bear stories were really quite amusing and amazing at the same time. Probably the one that is the one that really should be put in a movie is, and she was walking on a fairly narrow road, a sort of a ledge on the side of the mountain, because she went to visit somebody in a neighboring village. And coming toward her on that same narrow ledge was the bear. And so she looked at the bear looked at her, and the bear, she said she discerned a disapproving expression on the bear's face, if you can imagine that. This says the bear looked at her and he actually shook his head. Whether that means the same in bear sign language as in human, that he shook his head, and with an even more disgusted expression on his face, he started climbing up the mountain and getting out of the way. So she was quite lucky at that time. And otherwise, she would be out in the summertime or when it got warm with the school children picking berries in the berry bushes, wild berries, and sort of a big bunch of bushes in a particular meadow. And they were there picking the berries, and they could hear that on the other side of the bush, somebody was picking berries there also. So they thought, geez, what is this? They could feel the tug on the bush. So one of the kids got around and looked. A whole bunch of bears was there picking berries also. So I believe they gathered their own baskets of berries and got out of the bear. Quite a bear-like area. But let's say that in many of these wild places, whether it's Siberia or Transylvania, just means in Latin beyond the forest. Silva is the forest. And so because when you got past the big ring of forests and then you got up on the Transylvanian plateau, then there it was quite habitable. So it's the land beyond the forest. That in all of these places you find certain unusual and ancient customs, folk magic, things of that sort, which you don't find elsewhere. So then the 20th century saw much scholarly research on the subject of shamanism, as I mentioned, primarily pioneered by the Romanian scholar Mircea Eliade, who fled the communists and ended up at the University of Chicago. And I knew several people who were students of his there, and of course he wrote a very large number of books, very, very interesting and very perceptive scholar. So one of the remarkable features of shamanism is one that indicates that it's what we might call its central psychological features and thrust seem to have survived among the European settlers that came to the New World, and in fact shamanistic elements continue, we might say, to morph into various expressions in the realm of American religion. So here are people who came from Northern and Western Europe, in various places, really not very shamanistic by that time, except maybe for some vestigial folk beliefs, but they took to a sort of shamanistic approach to reality fairly soon after they came to America. So why would that be the case? If you study the history of all these various astonishing and weird groups who settled in the Hudson Valley, the Quakers and Shakers and early proto-Mormons and you name it, and all, there is an element there that when you compare it with the shamanistic phenomena, you find a great similarity. All of these people would like to go into trances. They, let's say, they had a natural proclivity for altered states of consciousness, to which fairly soon in the 19th century, very, very soon around the time when they came to America, they were able to add something that I mentioned, I think, very briefly, mesmerism. Because back in Europe, there's a sort of unconventional Austrian doctor, not the one later on Sigmund Freud with his little cigars, no, but much, much earlier, right around just before the French Revolution, had discovered certain techniques whereby he could induce altered states of consciousness in people. I have a great deal of material on it. Sometimes we might have a complete series of talks on mesmerism, but that is not really our purpose at this point. But let's say that the time had come for all kinds of people in Europe and then eventually in America to contemplate the possibility that one can experience, and I almost said enjoy, because sometimes it's quite enjoyable, states of consciousness other than the ordinary ones. That people, consciousness could change for a while, and they would see unusual sights, they would commune with beings that they ordinarily couldn't commune with, they would talk with spirits, with angels, with all kinds of entities and so forth, and thereby, you might say, enlarge their consciousness with experiences that otherwise would not have been available to them. I mentioned him last time too. A good example, because of he had a lot of talent. Talent and moxie was the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith, who apparently, since he was very young, had the ability, I don't think he ever heard of Mesmer at that time, he had the ability to experience unusual states of consciousness. And he started out as a rural magician, and then, led a very large religious group that became really a world religion. So people with that kind of an orientation, who were really oriented to something different than the ordinary mundane reality in which they lived, their jobs, their work and so forth, and who just because of that orientation no longer went along with the conventional religiosity. These people were not convinced Anglicans or Presbyterians or whatever, which would have come from Scotland, and the various that became the solid, the mainstream churches in the country, which when you walk down on the old streets of New York, you see all these big, massive 18th and 19th century churches of the mainstream religion, but they had their own unusual approach to things. And once again, one cannot help but wonder, could it be that they were attracted to this land and certain portions of this land, maybe originally the Hudson Valley, because there was something there. There was some kind of a feeling, there was some kind of an energy, some kind of a stimulus that came out of the very soil itself, and that had a conjunction with their own proclivities and their own desires in that direction. And so the original, as I mentioned, the original home of this native shamanism beginning in 1776, so we might say the founding fathers of the Republic had present among their constituents, among their early citizens, what could be called the founding immigrant shamans, those who, the people who saw visions, the people who were prophesying, the people who were really vitally interested in the, so to say, in the other reality, who came to this country. So a shamanistic element, a shamanistic popular element, was part of the earliest groups of settlers in the country. So initially composed, these groups initially were very small, but then they, of course, expanded. So, for instance, there was, one could quote many of them. There was a prophetess clear back in 1780 when they were here and attracted some attention. Anne Lee, Mother Lee. She was the founder of the so-called Shakers. Now, I don't need to explain to you why a shaker is a shaker. Well, a shaker is a shaker because he shakes. In other words, as they were going into these altered states, they would undergo bodily phenomena, and quite a few others over the years. Once again, the magical and occult history of the early, let's say, the early occult traditions is also really quite interesting. The burnt over district is really quite interesting. By the early 19th century, here's another one worth mentioning, a William Miller, not a very not a very uncommon name, founded a group that came to be called, you guessed it, the Millerites. And he was called by the press, you know, the media were always an unkind bunch back then too, even as they are now. He was called Mad Miller. He attracted considerable fame. Now we are really talking about early 19th century, and for one thing, he predicted the end of the world. A lot of people did that, and so I always like to hear about the Millerites and their practices awaiting the end of the world, because even as people like that sometimes do nowadays, they were convinced that they should position themselves in places of some elevation, because when the angels are coming to grab people and take them at the end of the world and save them, they have to see them. And so the Millerites like to climb up on things when they thought that the end was coming, and they would climb up on haystacks, for instance. So there were the Millerites on top of the haystacks, but on the other hand, mischievous neighborhood boys would come around. They set fire to the haystack at the ground level. And as the smoke was rising, the Millerites up on the haystack were beginning to wonder as to what part of the eternal world were they finding themselves with all that smoke coming to them, and then had to flee. So undoubtedly there were unusual events of this sort that often occurred. Now then, so what we need to keep in mind, which I really, I referred to that to some extent last time now too, is that what we are dealing with is not just, let's say, religious madness or, psychotic or semi-psychotic states that people went in on a religious ground, but that people discovered on their own that there is more to life, there is more to awareness, more to consciousness than what ordinarily appears. And that therefore, when some kind of contact is made with that order, that mysterious order, this is a very exciting thing. This is something that lends an ultimate or almost ultimate meaning to one's life. And this is, of course, what people following these esoteric and often secret disciplines have always known. The meaning of life is not an intellectual formula, as many religions with their theologies have put forth. But the meaning of life is contact with an ongoing, very lively and very exciting kind of reality that we don't ordinarily encounter in the physical world, or even in the mental world. And so when people get hold of that, or when it gets hold of them, they are usually quite excited and they are quite appreciative. So I am suggesting that from a very early period of the United States and even before the founding of the United States, there were elements present in this land that became the USA, which were oriented to this other reality. And that this became a much more important factor in the psyche of the American people than we ordinarily realize or ordinarily accept. Could it then be that among the founders of the country, among these beautiful, well-groomed gentlemen with their powdered wigs and their beautiful long frock coat, and especially those buckled shoes that I always envy, that there were quite a few there who had a sympathy for this sort of thing, who recognized in the shamanism that radiated from the land and that captured many of the settlers who went there, that they recognized there's something important, something very valuable, something that they themselves, through other means, through the secret associations of Rosicrucianism, of Freemasonry, of Martinism, of the various esoteric groups that they contacted from and in Europe, were familiar with. So, there is something very mysterious here. I think that we need to try to sympathize with that and recognize what it really might have been. Namely, that the notion that a new order of the ages, as written on the Great Seal of the United States, might be forged in this land. Why? Because the conditions, both psychic, generally in terms of the psyche of the land, and of the interests and the predilections of the individuals who came here, predisposed this land to something of this sort. And that is where we find, and we can find the original statements, many of them in Mitch Horowitz's books in Occult America and elsewhere, that a large number of people among the founders of the United States believed that something of a potentially very great spiritual profundity was starting here. That they managed to create a framework within which the forces, the influence of transcendence, of the other world, of that which is disclosed by altered states of consciousness, might come about and might function. And if we accept that possibility, then I think a number of other important conclusions may arise. One of them might be that we could feel obligated to those who founded the American Republic to try to tune in to the spiritual forces that motivated them and to pursue them. The great religious, great freedom of religion, the great religious tolerance which came about in this country, the only country, at least at that time of the world, where you could start any kind of religion anywhere you wanted, as long as you paid your taxes, if there were some of them. Very, very unusual. Why would this have happened? Why would this have been promoted? It would have been much easier for the founders of the United States to accept the Church of England, which was very much the religious milieu of the elite coming from England and so on, as the state religion, as state religions existed in many other countries. But there was something else. And this something else appears, it sort of peeks out here and there from the various historical details. And, well, let's see how we are. Right, I think it's, I'm coming close to conclusion. But I will conclude with an incident which we may come back to at our final lecture, because it relates to Los Angeles, because sort of by the 1890s, so in the very latter part of the 19th century, there began this movement from the East and from the Midwest of the Esoteric to come here. And one way in which that manifested, to make the long story short at this point, that there was a very interesting gentleman whom unfortunately I never met, although I knew his widow was a darling lady, Betty Warrington in Ojai, but his initials were A.P. Warrington, and he was sort of a very important figure, a leading light in the Theosophical Society. And he decided that the place to go was out west. And so he came. And he wanted to establish a colony of theosophists, of occultists, out here in the West. He even considered buying real estate in Mexico and setting it up there, but then he found that somehow the atmosphere, political and otherwise, wasn't quite what he wanted. And so he decided to start this colony, which he named Crotona, by the Greek name that the Pythagorean colony in Sicily bore in ancient times. You can probably see, if you drive down South Wilton Place, and you come to a sort of the street makes kind of a big jag somewhere near past Santa Monica Boulevard there. There were a couple of beautiful old houses. They were the first houses of the old Crotona, where Mr. Warrington established. And then he said, well, no, there is a better place. And he came up on Beechwood Drive. And where there was very little going in, a few going on here, a few houses or so forth, and he found he delineated a pretty large stretch of land on the on the west side of Beechwood Drive, where they established and built the old Crotona. Now, that just by way of background. This gentleman had also befriended a then quite young and sort of up-and-coming esoteric scholar by the name of Manly Palmer Hall, who had just come around. See, all the important people and influences all moved right around the term just before and then during the turn of the century, from the 19th to the 20th century here. Among other things, he communicated to Manly Hall and told Manly Hall that there was a document which he had in the archives of a certain division of the Theosophical Society, and that this document had referred to the events of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States, and some strange events that occurred at that time that very few people knew about. He finally became so friendly with Manly Hall that he gave copies of these documents to him, and they were published in ancient journals and in very, very old books, and the Theosophists had gotten hold of them, and he had them. And what these documents disclosed was that right at the time of the separation of the United States from the mother country, England, there was a hidden hand, a secret influence that was present. That, for instance, there was these things have subsequently been published. For instance, that there was a mysterious gentleman who was a friend of Benjamin Franklin, interestingly and significantly enough, who had a great deal to do with the marshalling the vote for the Declaration of Independence, because there was a pretty big step to take, and a lot of the legislators who were present there were afraid. For one thing, they were guilty of high treason, and they could be executed thereafter. And there was this unknown man who got up and gave a short speech, and which concluded that America has to be free, and created a great deal of enthusiasm, and the vote was favorable as the result of that. But when they wanted to go and thank him, he was nowhere to be found, and the doors were locked. And so there was this incident and a couple of others that indicated that some mysterious influences were present and were pushing for the independence of the United States, and were, they're helpful in this regard. Now, the reason that Mr. Warrington was so interested in this was that a few years before, these materials had been conveyed to the foundress and the principal teacher of the Theosophical Society, Madame Blavatsky. I don't know whether she was in India still or whether she was already in England, but she was editing a journal. And in one of her editorials she said, and I'm trying to quote, we have, speaking of in the editorial, we have documentary evidence of the fact that the independence of the United States was facilitated and given a great deal of support by the certain persons of the secret esoteric assemblies in Europe. And that these incidents which Mr. Warrington had dug up were part of that. It was from these disclosures, let us say, that people like Manly Palmer Hall and others gained their abiding conviction that there was a secret intentionality, a secret will from mysterious but very important sources that manifested in the founding of the American Republic, and that this in turn had a very powerful connection with the esoteric tradition in various places, including in Europe. Let's say the moving of the large number of theosophists and following Mr. Warrington to Cortona in Beechwood Drive at that very time had a great deal to do with reaffirming, at least amongst people in the esoteric tradition, eventually through Manly P. Hall, let's say that there was a generally not known and not communicated secret intentionality behind the founding and the early history of this country, and that this was of very great importance. And let's say it was generally mentioned, and I still knew some of these people, just like I knew Mr. Warrington's widow, that it was right in this room, I have often heard the saying made, statement made that, why do you think that the Theosophical Society was founded in New York City and not in London and not in Bombay? Things like that. And by two people who were both American citizens. One a naturalized and the other one the Yankee from Connecticut. Why? Because this was considered the fertile ground for the starting of, let's say, the starting of esoteric America. Now, it is, to us it should be a little bit a happy thing and a good omen that in turn so much of this moved out here to Los Angeles and to Beechwood Canyon and went on here and was reasserted here. It was only after World War I in the 1920s or so, when financial and other difficulties forced these interesting people, these theosophical, by now late friends of mine, to then move much of their operation to the Ojai Valley, but the place is still there. I have promised my friends now for years, and now it's more difficult for me than ever because I have to have somebody walking with me, but when we don't no longer have to wear masks and things of that sort, we are going to have a tour of Old Cortona. And I'll be able to point out to you the buildings. This is the building where Annie Besant stayed so many times before. This is a building that was built for such a purpose or another. And somehow, let's say, the well, you know, I could go on, and but then you are not going to come back at all, no matter what what the news bring. But let's say the important thing to keep in mind is that we are, whether we are in Beechwood Canyon or anywhere else, that we are sort of on sacred ground. You know, there is something that has gone on here, and that in its own way is still going on here, which is a spiritual influence, a transcendental influence. Jeffrey Hodgson, the great seer, on the basis of whose visions the pictures in these stained glass windows were made. You know, Mr. Hodgson was here. There, Mr. Hodgson has a book which is now out of print called The Kingdom of the Gods. And in it he largely deals with what he calls the angelic kingdom. And he had an artist whom I also met who did all, on the basis of his descriptions, did the paintings, the illustrations in the book of these angelic beings. And some of those pictures are in all the stained glass windows here and in the office also. So let's say there were influences here. There is a history here. And I think there is not only a past history, but there is a future. And if we are appreciative of the past, in this respect particularly, then we will merit the future. It is always that way. People who don't value the past are not going to have much of a future. And usually they don't have much of a present either, because these dimensions are connected with each other, and there is a certain spiritual lifeblood that flows through them. And so in this particular occasion, it's important for us to remember that it seems that the founding of the entire United States and so much of the forces underlying its history, way back from the 1700s, all had certain, not openly proclaimed, but nevertheless very much present spiritual overtones. And that so does this place, and so does this city. And Alan Watts, who was a terrific guy, I had a great respect for him. Alan Watts wrote in his autobiography that, you know, he came from England, he went to the state of New York, then he was in Chicago. He went through the whole route that the esoteric tradition usually, and then he ended up here in California. And he said, now I have gone so far west that if I went any further, I would be ending up east. So maybe there is a reason why we are here. There are individual reasons for all of us. Maybe we have come to this place, and maybe this indeed was and secretly still is, and maybe more openly will become a sacred land, and a land from which the interior transforming and informing wisdom will flow. I have a very strong feeling that that is true. I have a very strong feeling that my initial impression way back in 1953 that this is the new Alexandria still holds true. And I have a strong feeling that if we become more and more conscious of that and do what we can within our own circumstances to keep that flame burning, to keep that flower blooming, whatever metaphors we want to use, then it will do so. And that the wisdom that has come here will not disappear, but will bear new fruit and will contribute to a spiritual revival of this culture and of this land, which it greatly needs and which it assuredly deserves. So this has been a little bit of a meandering, but I thank you for having been here, and I think you probably get the feeling that I'm trying to convey. This is something very, very precious to me. I haven't been here all these years for any other reason. And I love America, I love the United States, I revere both its outer and its inner spirit, and I also can repeat with St. Paul, who said that he was the citizen of no mean city. This is an important place, and we are undoubtedly in our own ways here for our own purposes. Let's try to be aware of them. Let's try to be grateful for where we are and of these others who have went before and who prepared the way. For out of that gratitude will come a future that will be much, much more promising than perhaps anything that we have experienced so far. And I thank you very much, and we'll conclude, I promise you, with some very interesting material next time. Thank you.